I'd like to talk today about a recent situation that upset and really confused many people, and that was the statue of Thomas Jefferson leaving the New York City Council chamber at City Hall. Many people saw this and they said, Thomas Jefferson, you've got to be kidding. He's one of our founding fathers. What are they doing removing the statue? People were upset, they were confused, they were like, well, what's this all about? Why is this happening? Why Thomas Jefferson? That statue had been there for 100 years, so, you're talking about a long time. What was the reason given? The reason given was that Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. And should we be honoring a slaveholder in this way? The statue will not be thrown out or destroyed or anything. It will be relocated into a special area of the New York Historical Society. So the statue and its historical meaning will be preserved. The issue was, what is the proper location for the statue? Being he was a slaveholder, let's kind of evaluate it, look at it, and see the reasoning behind it. Basically, when you look at Thomas Jefferson, you see a wonderful man, many achievements, of course, but you also see contradictions. Jefferson says, all men are created equal. And this all men are created equal became just such a rallying cry for the revolution in the Declaration of Independence. And the sense that we're all created equal became just one of those bedrock teachings that we accept. He said liberty, freedom, is an inalienable right. So we have this right to be free. However, along with saying all men are created equal, and along with saying that liberty is this inalienable right, he held hundreds of humans in violently enforced bondage. So this was a system that used violence to make sure that the slaves stayed in the state they were. This was not kind of your nice slaveholding type of situation. This was whips were used, violence was used, people were beat. This was slavery at its worst in terms of what was happening. A lot of times we get this impression of slavery that, oh, the slaves were happy. This was so nice. They were treated so well. They took this nice trip from Africa, and yeah, they were in chains, but that they were treated well by their masters. The historical evidence, of course, contradicts this. The whip was used frequently. There was torture involved. Terrible things happened to the slaves, and so the whole system was based in violence when you look at it. Jefferson also expressed the view that Africans were mentally and physically inferior to whites. So while he had these slaves, he said, when you look at them, you have to see that, they're physically inferior, we're superior, but also mentally. They're mentally deficient. They can't really reason and think and come to the same level that we as white people are at. So this idea that all are created equal except blacks, all are entitled to liberty except blacks, this was what Jefferson espoused. Certainly a great man, a lot of wonderful accomplishments, but we have to look honestly and clearly at what he espoused. He understood that slavery was a moral atrocity. He knew that. He said slavery is terrible from a moral perspective. But basically, what he did was he entrenched it in the American Republic. In the writings, he just, accepted it as something that, this has to be part of our republic. He denounced the British Crown for refusing to stop the importation of enslaved Africans into the colonies. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence listed the slave trade as a grievance against King George. So he knew that the slave trade was wrong. It was a grievance that they originally listed, but yet it was perpetuated anyway. So it wasn't like he was ignorant of the fact that this was a moral evil. He knew it was a moral evil, but yet for what he deemed practical reasons, it had to be accepted, it had to be continued. And that grievance against King George was removed in deference to the pro-slavery Southern delegates. So the Southern delegates would not have accepted the Declaration of Independence if this grievance against the king about slavery and the slave trade was listed. So he gave in to that pressure. The Southern delegates didn't want it, and so he omitted it from the Declaration. And as president, when he was elected president, and afterwards as one of the elder statesmen who was looked up to as a founding father, well respected, he maintained a public silence on the subject of slavery, so he didn't comment on it. Now, when you look at it, you say, well, why did he have this attitude of silence? Why did he have this attitude of acknowledging it as a moral atrocity, but yet perpetuating it, continuing it, not only in the Republic, but in his own plantation? Well, if we look at some of the reasons, we look at his own interests as a slaveholder. There was an economic reality in terms of his plantation, having the slaves to work the land, to make the money, to continue to survive. Jefferson frequently had financial problems. He was building his mansion, the Monticello, and he would buy a lot of things from Europe, and a lot of times there was a balance of payments issue with him in terms of running into deficits. So, eliminating slavery from the plantation economically, that would have been difficult for him. And secondly, his belief that this was a necessary political compromise in order to hold the country together at this vulnerable time when they were just starting out to eliminate slavery. That would have been very difficult, and it would have fractured the unity that was there. It was just beginning. There were all sorts of difficulties in uniting people. Now throw slavery into the mix and the economic reality that it embodied. All of the plantation owners in the South would have been upset and would have not been able to accept it. And we have to remember that slavery was reality not only in the South, but also in the North at this time. So this would have been a very difficult issue, even though he knew on a moral basis this was not good. So you run into this paradox. Jefferson and his assertion of human equality and liberty in the Declaration of Independence. People read that, and it inspired people to oppose slavery both in the United States and in Europe. People read it and they said, wow, this is amazing. This is true. And it really inspired people. George Fitzhugh, for example, said Jefferson was the architect of ruin of slavery because his words led to the abolition of slavery. His words about equality, it led to that. So he was this architect of ruin. He was the one who eventually led to the end of slavery. So on the one side of the coin, Jefferson symbolizes a founding that is based on racism, that is based on oppression. But on the other side, slavery and racism were a colonial legacy that the founding fathers failed to overcome. So it was there, it was in the colonies. The founding fathers had this challenge to try to overcome it, and they were not able to do it. The Declaration of Independence, of course, was a challenge to that legacy. Criticism of this move about the statue People on the right would say, well, removing the statue of Jefferson, that the progressives are attacking the American founding and are trying to delegitimize our system of government. So they're attacking the founding of our country, the very founding of our country. How dare they? And also saying that our system of government is not a good system. On the left, people say, well, historical figures should be canceled if they don't meet modern day standards. So that seems to be, the kind of the back and forth. People say, well, on the one part, they're not honoring the founding. On the other part, they really are saying, you've got to meet the standards of today. And if you don't meet the standards of today, then we're going to limit you. We're going to kind of change it around. But what is the real question here? The question is, are those standards just modern day standards? I believe that's the real question we have to look at. Is there something that is so intrinsically evil about the type of brutal slavery that was routinely practiced in the United States that it should never have been tolerated and should never be celebrated in any fashion, directly or indirectly, by honoring those who practiced it in such an extensive fashion? Is there something that is just so bad, so evil about this institution called slavery that we must in every way speak out against it? Is it just saying about the moral standards of today, or is there something about slavery that was always wrong? It was tolerated, it was allowed, it was enshrined in law, but that really doesn't make it right. And so the question is there something here that is intrinsically evil? And is there a moral difference between having a few slaves and hundreds of slaves? And Jefferson had, hundreds of slaves. But is there any moral difference there? You're still practicing this institution that is really intrinsically evil. Also, there's a question about location. Is the city council chamber an appropriate location, especially given that there are a number of black city council members? So here you have these black city council members, and you have this statue of Jefferson. Is this appropriate? Is this saying in some way, acquiescing to this institution of slavery and the legacy that it has brought forth even to today in our country? So the idea that this location is a good location for it, maybe initially there was no problem, no black city council members, it was all white, and so it was not raised. But is it appropriate now? Is the New York Historical Society actually a more appropriate location in the sense that you're honoring his role in framing the Declaration of Independence and as President of the United States, which is very appropriate to honor? He was a founding father. He wrote the Declaration, which inspired the anti-slavery movement, right? And he was a president. He did a lot of wonderful things. He was an ambassador in France, did a lot of great things. And so he should be honored certainly for those, and is the Historical Society maybe the appropriate place rather than a deliberative body, the City Council Chamber? And of course, it raises the larger question about the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Is this appropriate? Certainly people will raise that question. And I think for the most part, people say, well, what you're honoring there at that memorial is, his legacy as a founding father. So I think this issue that was raised about Jefferson and the statue raises a lot of intriguing questions. And I think the most salient for me is about the intrinsic evil of slavery. I think that's an important question to look at. And it's a question really that I think transcends time, historical era, this brutal type of slavery. Even though accepted, was it intrinsically evil?